Well, welcome to a new episode of the Afterword, our series of conversations with our favorite authors on books, reading, and the church. Our guest today is Jonty Rhodes, who's the head pastor of Christ Church, a congregation of the International Presbyterian Church in Leeds, England. Jonty has spent the last 10 years or so planting churches around the UK, and he's the author of the just released Man of Sorrows, King of Glory. And this is really one of our favorite kinds of books, which takes foundational but perhaps neglected aspects of the Reformed faith and applies them to our lives today in ways that are fresh and devotional and understandable. Nancy Guthrie says this about it. She says, "Man of Sorrows, King of Glory is rich without being dense, theological without being stuffy, and corrective without being combative." And right now you can pick up a copy of this on our website, wtsbooks.com, and it's half price until July 8th when that sale ends. So with that, by way of introduction, let me hand it over to Johnny and Jonty with a question for both of you. One of the taglines here at the Westminster Bookstore is Biblically Faithful Books, Kindergarten through MDiv. And we love those short board books that share the gospel with our youngest children on the one hand, and on the other hand, we do love those 700-page dense theological works that take your whole lifetime to wade through. But I've heard from some publishing friends of mine that perhaps the UK market doesn't have as much of an appetite for those bigger sized books, and that perhaps the average churchgoer doesn't have as much desire to read that type of book. What would you guys say to that? Do you think there's a difference between the reading habits in the US compared to the UK? Johnny?
Well, Josiah, I think you're about to find two British ministers become quite defensive for their tribe. After all, the banner of truth arose in the UK, and those are meaty, hefty theological books. So I'm not sure I would agree with the sort of stereotype that maybe some publishers in the States have given you. I think people in the UK, Christians, are interested in meaty theology. Perhaps maybe it's just that we don't produce as much over in the UK as far as authors go. Maybe publishers, it's just not as big a volume compared to the States. But I think there is a hunger, certainly in the IPC churches and some of the more Reformed Baptist churches, for hefty theological books and for reading them. Perhaps another aspect of it is that there's I think a more healthy focus on evangelism in the UK and UK churches. And so maybe the case of we produce a lot of books that are written at a very simple level for the unbeliever so that they can understand the gospel at a very basic level. So maybe that's where the comment's coming from. I don't know, what do you think, Jonty?
Yeah, well, when I wrote my first book, it was published in English first, in England first by IVP. But when it was taken to America, they renamed it Covenants Made Simple, which was kind of implying it needed some dumbing down for the Americans. So, yeah, like you, Johnny, I'll defend the UK a little bit. I think it's probably fair to say there is a strain of anti-intellectualism in at least part of conservative evangelicalism, the part that I've come from, which perhaps has led us away from or has separated doctrine and devotion, as if rich devotion doesn't rely on doctrinal thinking, or perhaps more commonly that deep doctrinal thinking doesn't lead to devotion. So I think there is some truth there. I couldn't say whether that's more true of the UK than the USA, because I don't know the US context. But I think that is something I've noticed, a slight fear that if you start thinking too hard, then it's just head knowledge and takes you away from the real love of Christ.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me of that C.S. Lewis quote where he said that he found more devotional value in a big, thick book of systematic theology with his pipe in his mouth and a pencil in his hand than he did, reading some of the more general devotional works.
Another good Northern Irishman.
Yeah, exactly. Got to get it in there somewhere. Well, Jonty, it's good to have you on the Afterword, this conversation about books, reading in the church. Obviously, I know you well. You're a good friend from back in the UK, and we're both ordained in the same denomination, the International Presbyterian Church. But many of our American listeners wouldn't have heard of you, or if they have, they don't know much about you. So tell us a wee bit about your background and your family.
Sure. I'm married to Georgina. We've got 4 kids, the eldest of whom is 7, and the youngest just 2. We've another way on the way in August, God willing. So yeah, busy home life. I'm a minister, church planter in the IPC, the International Presbyterian Church, and at the moment I'm in Leeds in the north of England. We are 3.5 years into a church plant there. Before that, I was 7 years in Derby, which is a slightly smaller English city. That was again a church plant, about 7 years there for a church plant. And Derby was the beginning of my Presbyterian journey. I've not grown up Presbyterian, not grown up Christian, really. So IPC for me came on the scene in I think about 2015, something like that.
Okay, so you weren't brought up in a Christian family, so tell us how you came to faith in Christ.
Yeah, I probably ought to qualify that a little bit. I was brought up going to Sunday school, taken along to the little village Anglican church. I grew up in rural Dorset, a real kind of farming community in the south of England. And it was a time when everybody went to church. Just, Sunday morning, you put on your best jumper, your smart trousers, and went and sat there. But it was far from evangelical. And I'd have said I was a Christian, but I'd have had no understanding at all, really. I remember, to my embarrassment, I remember when I left my first school, so I'd have been about 12, and we were all given Bibles in assembly. And the kind of tradition was you got your friends to sign their name because you're going off to different schools. And a teacher who was an evangelical, I now realise, although I didn't at the time, wrote in there, I can't remember exactly what verse, but I think it was one of Isaiah's prophecies of Christ, tender and gentle. Or I can't remember exactly what it was. It was a beautiful description of Christ. But I had no idea at the time that it was a prophecy about Jesus. And I just thought, that's a lovely thing to write about me. So that was my level of understanding of the gospel at that time, applying scriptures about, the Saviour to myself. So it wasn't really, I went to boarding school, classic English boarding school, the kind of thing you kind of see in movies in the US, I guess. And it was there, amazingly, I had an evangelical Christian as my tutor. Each member of staff at the school probably had about 8 or 9 boys to look after. I was with this guy, Richard, who was a Christian, invited me along to the Christian meeting, and it was through that and summer camps that I came to faith.
Okay, that's great. So I think this is a first for the Afterword to have some of the upper echelons of British society on the show, the aristocracy. Good to have you on, Jonty, for that purpose alone. What took you from becoming a Christian into Christian ministry and wanting to study? I know you studied at Oak Hill College in London.
Yeah.
How did that transition come about?
Yeah, I studied history as an undergrad, and after leaving university, I taught Latin for 1 year. That's my one year of real life work on the mean streets of Norfolk. But after that, I went to work for a church, thinking it would just be a year. I was doing youth work, children's groups. I probably preached 4 or 5 times in the year. That was an Anglican church, an evangelical Anglican church, and the minister there invited me to stay on for a second year, and then 2 turned into 4. And it was really his encouragement that led me to think about ministry longer term. I think at that stage, I knew I wasn't an Anglican. I knew I wasn't a Baptist, but I didn't really know what I was. So when I went off to Oak Hill, I went funded by this Anglican church, but not as an Anglican, which was amazingly generous of them, really, because they were forking out tens of thousands of pounds for, essentially for no net gain for themselves. But I also, to be honest, I look back and I think I actually went in too young and not thoughtfully enough. Like, as you know, Johnny, there's a kind of strain of conservative evangelicalism in England that is great in many ways, and I owe a lot too, but is quite just a bit slapdash when it comes to going into ministry, I think. So I was told, my wife was told as well at university, more or less, if you are a well-educated, university-educated, thoughtful guy who is living a basically moral life, you ought to go into ministry. You need a good excuse not to. So there's no sense of calling. That was dismissed as something for the charismatics, or a strange thing for the mystics, the Welsh or whatever, the Northern Irish, the Scots, but not for us English people. And you had to explain why you weren't going in if you had a pulse and you were Christian and living a vaguely godly life. So I look back with shame, to be honest, and think I went in far too casually, without the kind of reflection and a sense of calling that I'd want to see in folk today.
And you've gone from being in seminary into a call. So even though you've been honest there about maybe going in too early, in the Lord's providence, it's still where He's called you as a minister.
Yeah.
And since then you've clearly had an internal and an external call. But what convinced you to become a Presbyterian?
It was slow, really. It was, again, in honesty, it was to begin with, it was a process of beginning to work out what I'm not. So I realised I wasn't an Anglican. So that the strength of the conservative evangelical church in England is really in Anglicanism and in the FIC, essentially kind of network of independent Baptist churches. They would each have, 700 or so congregations, something like that. But I knew I wasn't a Baptist. I knew I wasn't an independent. I worked out during Oak Hill that I was a Reformed Peter Baptist, but I'd never met a Presbyterian. I mean, even at Bible college, even at seminary, if you can believe it, I knew Presbyterians existed, but I couldn't have told you what they were, and I'd never met one. So it was having come out the other end. I went back and did 3 years working in the Church of England again, sort of unofficially. The bishop said he'd close his eyes and look the other way and let me get on with it. But it was over that time I started reading Influence of America, and came across some of the guys, again, Johnny, you know well, some of the guys in the IPC. I started just meeting up with them. And because around 2008, I think it was, that Anglican church asked me to lead a church plant, but said you'll have to decide the ecclesiology. I knew I had to nail my colours to the mast. So it was, I was through reading, meeting other guys in the IPC, that I finally came to the light.
You came home.
I mean, I didn't have the advantage you've got of having an elder brother just to tell you what to do. I never had that. So your transition from being an independent Baptist to a Presbyterian,
Yeah, or having an older brother that you have your hand up his back, that's great. That's great. And looking back on your time at Oak Hill, and you've planted a church in Derby, 7 years there now, 3.5 into the church plant in Leeds. What do you think that you can't learn at seminary? Obviously, seminary, or college as we call it in the UK, is a great training ground. It's necessary in many respects, but it's not sufficient. So what do you think that you can't learn at seminary that you just learn on the job, in the job?
I suppose it's a bit like, seminary, you can stock the store cupboard, stock the kitchen with all the kind of things you need, but it's only when the kids arrive you learn how to cook and serve the food. So I think Oak Hill was great for teaching all the things that seminaries teach you, but coming out the other end and learning how to communicate that, both in preaching, but also it's I think probably even harder just in the pastoral work, the counselling. You can read all the books you like about marriage or whatever, but until you're sat with a couple whose marriage is falling apart, no classroom in the world can teach you how to deal with that, really. So it's that move from all the knowledge you've got stored up to how you actually deal with real flesh and bones. That's what it's often a critique of guys who just popped out of college, isn't it? Their preaching is very sound, very clear, but missing the target. Kind of like a machine gun spraying everywhere, but not hitting home, because they just not had the time to know who they're preaching to, get used to the congregation. But yeah, you tell me. You're the one who teaches week in, week out.
Yeah, but I'm very glad I did 2 years in ministry before I came, because I think it would have been a bit of a fraud trying to train people for ministry, but never having done any myself. You know, I always find it strange people who go from PhD, from MDiv to PhD to teaching at a seminary, training men, but they've never been a minister. So I'm thankful for that, and I agree. I think you don't really, you think you know theology and doctrine and how to preach until every week you have to do it week in, week out. I remember my first 3-4 months as the associate at Cambridge Presbyterian, finding my bucket was empty of all illustrations, all analogy, out of a sermon. I'd used up everything that I'd ever known, and I was scrambling each week, phoning people like Paul Levy, trying to find an illustration for something, you know. Yeah, it's just that life experience, isn't it? Learning on the job that you can't really get at seminary. I often think seminary is like the first 4 years of training, and then your first internship or assistant minister, associate minister is really the next phase of training to become a minister. Obviously, you can still be ordained, but when you really hit your groove is a couple of years into that assistantship. Yeah. Do you want to just briefly talk about the IPC? You're part of this Presbyterian denomination. You said you didn't know a Presbyterian when you went to Oak Hill, but now you're part of this denomination that I'm ordained in as well, which we love very much with all its quirks. Just share with folk what it is and how we actually are trying to train guys coming out of seminary, giving them internships or assistant minister positions.
Yeah. The first Presbyterian church service I ever went to, I was leading. I was the ordained minister leading the service. So that gives you an indication of how kind of cowboy it was. But yeah, I mean, in some ways, the denomination's been going a while. Francis Schaeffer set it up he came over after the Second World War, was sent over to bring a report back to the States on the state of the church in Europe. And during that time, to cut a long story short, he got the bug for coming back and working over here. So it began, IPC, International Presbyterian Church, began in the 50s out in Switzerland. I think the first congregation was, maybe Italy first, then Switzerland, I can't remember, but up in the Alps. But his vision of a church without borders that was teaching the Reformed faith and trying to hold to the purity of the church. I think those 3 things that he particularly emphasised in the early days is a good one, and one we've tried to hold to. But really, in England, for a long time there were 2 congregations, 3 congregations for most of the sort of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s even. And it's only in the last 10, 15 years that's grown to whatever we are, about a dozen now across England and Scotland. There are also Korean-speaking churches in the UK, and some more on the continent, some more in South Korea itself. But in terms of kind of English-speaking Presbyterian, I think we're about a dozen churches. I mean, the healthy side of that is that you've got to be convictionally Presbyterian to join. You're not going to tumble into it or just stumble in because that's where there's a vacancy. You're probably going to have to plant if you're a minister coming in. And so we've tried to, as you said, develop a more robust way of training the next generation than I ever had, certainly, and maybe even yourself. So often we'll have guys who'll come and work as interns for a couple of years, maybe just out of university, kind of young guys trying to get a taste for things, trying to convince them of the Reformed faith and Presbyterian ecclesiology. We then send them to college. So again, most guys at the moment, I think, are still coming to the States. Bizarrely, it's often cheaper for them to study in the US at a Westminster or what's that other place?
RT.
That's the one. RTS.
Yeah. We're only allowed to use the acronym. We're not allowed to use the full title.
Yeah, so guys will study there 3 or 4 years, come back to citizenship to plant, more or less. Which it is difficult. It means that some men who'd be great to fill pulpits if they were empty just can't find a place in the denomination. But it does mean that focus on mission is unavoidable. And so we've got God willing, a bit of a plan to keep planting over the next few years. And over the last few years, we've planted more or less a congregation every year somewhere else in the country.
Yeah, it's been exciting to be a part of it, even though I'm at a distance now. It's still a denomination that I think's got real potential, and exciting to see even from afar how it's continuing to be blessed by God and to grow. So, okay, so let's get into one of your books. Speaking about Presbyterianism, Covenants Made Simple, or the British title was Reading the Lost Ark, with an allusion to Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. Why did you decide to write a book about covenants?
Yeah, in some ways, I don't know if you find this with your own writing, but the little I have written, it's been first of all about educating myself more than anyone else. So I see these blind spots in my own theological education and my own reading, and try and I suppose read myself clear, and then end up wanting to teach it at church. So that book began as a series. It was a midweek teaching series, I think, at Derby. And I realised that I'd been taught almost no covenant theology, even though by this stage I'd been in evangelical churches for 15 years probably, but just almost nothing on the covenants, which seems probably bizarre to many of your listeners, but it's just a reality over here. The idea of covenant theology is which is, I think, be fair to say, it's pretty much neglected in conservative evangelicalism in lots of the UK at least, or lots of England. That's probably unfair to say the UK. I'm sure the Scots and the Northern Irish are more on the ball. And so, having taught it as a midweek series, this book on covenant theology, I was struggling to find something simple enough to give to congregation members, as an introduction, a primer that could be read by someone who'd never even come across the phrase before. So that was the origin of the book.
Maybe this goes back to Josiah's first question, about meaty books. Maybe that's where it's coming from. American Christianity and certainly Presbyterianism has had a very strong, evangelicalism has had perhaps a better, stronger appreciation for the covenant than maybe we have, because Presbyterianism's been so small in recent century or so in the UK. I remember a comment that John Woodhouse made. I studied at Moore College, as you know, and we were sitting in Old Testament overview first year, and my friend Dinesh, who's from Singapore, asked him a question. He says, I've noticed that you've been teaching this course, you haven't really structured it around covenant. It's more been just like the story of the Old Testament or by overviews of each book. Can I ask why you haven't really looked at covenant? And Woodhouse paused for a moment and then said, well, because it's not really a big deal, is it, in the Bible?
Yeah.
And what was interesting was he had actually structured everything around promise and fulfillment.
Yeah.
And then years later, it dawned on me, this conversation or this comment in class, and I then went up, thought, what's the Hebrew for promise? How many the word promise occur in the Old Testament? And then I realized that there is no Hebrew word for promise.
Yeah.
It's the phrase kasher dever, just as he said. So, here was this Old Testament theology being taught, which was very good. I learned a lot more, but it just was bereft of any theological substructure. And then berit, the covenant, the word for covenant is used 285 times in the Old Testament, which, so it is actually a concept that's quite prominent.
We've got a similar thing, I think, with evangelicals always wanting to talk about a relationship with God. No one's got any problem at all about speaking about, do you have a relationship with God? Do you have a relationship with Jesus? But the same people then get very uppity if you start talking about covenants. But it's the same point again, isn't it? What is the Bible's term for your relationship with God? Well, it's a covenant. So we do our Bible overviews, and it's often very kingdom focused, one way or another, story of a kingdom, that kind of thing. But then it's not. Covenant is almost viewed with suspicion, I think, in England at the moment.
And Graham Goldsworthy's works, which I've appreciated and have been influenced by, in the good parts of it, is the kingdom is the the story of the Bible. I think that's right. Ritterboss and Bavinck and Voss would all agree with that. But they had a covenantal structure to the story. And it's interesting that Goldsworthy only picks up on covenant from Genesis 12, doesn't really deal with covenant of works, doesn't think there was one, doesn't deal with the covenant in Genesis 3:15, doesn't deal with the covenant with Noah, just sort of really picks the story up at chapter 12 of Genesis. And I think that shows, because if you don't begin where covenant really begins, in the garden with the covenant of works, and then the covenant of grace with the promise to Eve, you sort of aren't really going to get the importance of the structure right from the beginning, you know.
I suspect that ties into the slight lack of interest in systematic theology as well. You know, if you do you can do very good Bible overviews, can't you, where you tell the story and what happened, but covenant, and part of the reason I wanted to write the book actually was covenant also gives shape to your ecclesiology, your understanding of the sacraments, your understanding of the atonement. You know, who is it? What's the relationship between Christ and those he died for? And if you're in a world that is suspicious of those kind of systematic questions, or at least sees them as very secondary, then the temptation is always to go to the sort of high level story way of explaining Scripture, because then you can duck the doctrinal ones.
Yeah. So in that book, Covenants Made Simple, you obviously go through the various covenants, covenant of works, and then the covenant of grace with its various administrations or expressions or manifestations at the different epochs of redemptive history. Do you want to just very briefly explain what you mean by the covenant of grace and how it functions in the Bible story?
Sure. I mean, as I said earlier, it's if we're trying to define covenant in a way that covered every single use of the word covenant in the Bible, you'd struggle a little bit, wouldn't you? If you've got Job making a covenant with his eyes, and you're going to end up with something very vague, like a relationship or something like that. But when we talk about the covenant of grace as a theological term, we're talking about the way that God has bound himself in promise to his people, and you see that the form, the relationship that relationship takes has a similar pattern all the way through Scripture, from the fall onwards at least, this saving plan of God. So you see God asking, requiring faith, in faith in his promises, faith ultimately in the mediator, in Christ. You see what he promises, the blessings he promises to his people, which are summed up in many ways by the kingdom, and the kingdom is the blessing that you receive, isn't it? You see the curses being cut off if you break this covenant, and ultimately that promise that begins, as you say, in Genesis 3, when the promise of the serpent crusher comes, it's the gospel promise. Paul can refer to to Abraham's covenant as the gospel in Galatians 3, can't he? The gospel was preached to Abraham. So it is that gospel that is preached that forms the people and is shaped by this covenant relationship, which then grows like a tree all the way through the Old Testament and comes to full flower in the New. But in essence, it is the same gospel, the same relationship, and therefore is forming the same people. It's forming one people, the one Church of God, from Adam and Eve through to us.
Yeah, you use the illustration there of the tree, and Voss uses that in his essay on the idea of biblical theology. He keeps referring to the word organic, this organic development of revelation, and I think that's the key thing. It's not these distinct covenants in the Old Testament, it's the one covenant of grace. Interesting, the Hebrew word berit, it never occurs in the plural in the Bible, it's always the singular, and I think it's conveying that there is really one covenant ultimately, but it goes through these organic developments, like from seed to little shoot with Noah, to a small tree with Abraham, to the big trunk with Israel, and then the branches with David, and then the full flower with Christ coming. What books influenced you on covenant to write that one?
I suppose two kind of eras really. In terms of modern things, I suppose the first thing that got me going on it was O. Palmer Robertson's Christ of the Covenants, which was, I think, the first thing I'd read on covenant, full stop, and the first time I began to see exactly what you've been talking about, the idea of the unity of the covenants throughout scriptures. But to dig deeper, a few other modern things, some of Mike Horton's stuff, Meredith Klein's, although I'd perhaps differ from them on a couple of things on the Mosaic covenant in particular. But really after that, it was a case of going further back and getting to the Puritans. And so for a while I was trying to read, Boston and Gillespie and all these guys to see what my heritage was, particularly if I was heading in towards Presbyterianism. And so I've often found that it's going back there that actually helps you get clearer than even some of the modern stuff.
Yeah. So that was your first book, and then you unwisely or wisely decided to try another one. It's coming out in June with Crossway, called Man of Sorrows, King of Glory. The subtitle is What the Humiliation and Exaltation of Jesus Means for Us. So it's a bit like a Jesus made simple, is it? Or is it not?
Yeah. I mean, I didn't pitch it like this to Crossway, but if the Covenants book is chapter 7 of the Westminster Confession made simple, then this one's chapter 8, really. The person work of Christ, twofold state, threefold office.
Yeah, and so tell us why did you decide to write a book about Jesus's person and work? Yeah, I think we have. You there, Jonty?
Yeah, I'm back. There you go. Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but you froze.
Okay, did you hear my question?
No.
Okay.
Right now.
So why did you decide to write a book about Jesus's person and work?
Yeah. The genesis actually came in. I was having a conversation with Brian Salter, he's pastor of Lookout Mountain Presbyterian Church, and we were just walking on the street in Leeds talking about preaching, and particularly about Old Testament sermons and the danger that they all end up sounding the same. You're an Old Testament professor, so you can speak more on this, but you kind of know how it goes, where you preach the text, you explain what's going on in the story, and then you think, I've got to speak about Jesus. And so somehow the last 5 minutes of every sermon, you get out your crowbar tool and end up speaking probably about penal substitution, and that's your big finale. And Brian made the offhand comment that he thinks in part that's because we haven't appreciated the richness of Christ's work as prophet, priest, and king. So we feel in a right desire to be cross-centered and Christ-centered, and passages like 1 Corinthians, resolved to know nothing with you apart from Christ crucified. We think that means that all you can speak about to be faithful is the cross. And frankly, if you're going to speak about the cross, the only thing you can speak about is penal substitutionary atonement if you're going to be properly, kind of robustly reformed or sound. And I think Brian made that comment as thinking nothing of it, but it just made me think afterwards and reflect on my own ministry and realise that although I was in a tradition that rightly had spent a lot of time defending penal substitution, there are various attacks on it over here in the UK, as I'm sure there are in the US as well. But it's a danger that I and perhaps others had therefore become a bit narrow. I sort of used the illustration before of, if you think of a sort of great painting, the Haywain or something, Turner's the Haywain, and if all you're looking at is the thing in the middle, the wagon in the middle, and you're missing the rest of the canvas, well, you're missing out. So yes, of course, Christ's death is at the centre of the gospel, and I think penal substitutionary atonement is central and essential to that. But there is more, and again, you don't have to go back too far, do you, to see that in in our forefathers and their preaching, their writing, this idea that you're to deal with Christ as prophet, priest, and king, and I think particularly lacking perhaps again a focus on his work, his ongoing work in his exaltation, not just his work in what's been known as his humiliation, his earthly life. So yeah, wanting a richer canvas, I suppose, to set the cross in, and a richer Jesus. I'd have called it the whole Christ if Sinclair hadn't nicked the title first, but I defer to Sinclair on all things.
He clearly got wind of it, stole it ahead of time. Yeah. Scots always do do that to the English. Yeah. So you've spoken there about the humiliation of Christ, the exaltation of Christ, the three offices of Christ, prophet, priest, king. Did you come up with this? Where did this come from? You know, they invented football, they invented rugby, you know, so.
Yeah. Wrote the Westminster Confession, then ignored it for 400 years. You'll have to, you can tell me on the history of it. I don't know if you find this when you study something for a while, don't you, or you write, and for a while, everything's at the fingertips because that's what you're studying. And then, I finished the book a year or so ago, and then it all goes out your mind. But throughout the history of the church, I mean, clearly people pick up on the fact that Jesus is a prophet, a priest, and a king because there's a New Testament terms. In terms of you can see hints of it. I think even in Eusebius and some of the really early stuff, but it comes to its, I suppose, clearest fruition at the Reformation. I think Luther would sort of push together prophet and king sometimes, and but by the time you get to certainly to the Confession and the writing of Calvin as well, this idea of a threefold office. So the office, he's the mediator, the Messiah, but a threefold aspect to it, that as the anointed one, he fulfills those three Old Testament offices, or the great offices of prophet, priest, and king. Is there very clearly in the Institutes. It's there in the Confession, isn't it? Chapter 8 of the Confession. It's there in Heidelberg. So yeah, not entirely unique to IPC or English public school boys.
Yeah, I think that's what I like about your book. You're trying to make contemporary and relevant for the church today, something that's been there all through church history, and something that was crystallized in Calvin and the post-Reformation dogmaticians, that there was this really rich perspective that Christ as the Son of God is the one mediator, and out of that mediatorial role he functions in these three offices of prophet, priest, king. But then I think it's the Heidelberg Catechism that probably puts it most clearly, and the Westminster Confession, that he has these two states, the state of humiliation and exaltation. I'm teaching Old Testament at the minute in 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and I've been trying to show the students that David is a mini Messiah who, after he's anointed king in 1 Samuel 16, Saul remains king, but David is really the true king. But David goes through this humiliation for the rest of 1 Samuel, and only in 2 Samuel does he experience exaltation. So David himself is, experiences these two states of humiliation and exaltation, and he does so as a prophet. He speaks God's word. He writes psalms.
Yeah.
He does it as a priest. He dances before the ark as it comes in to Jerusalem. All his sons are priests, and obviously then as the king, he's the king. So you see it in these Old Testament figures of this prophet, priest, king, functioning as God's holy covenant representative. I think what it's done for me in teaching it and having to research it, it really enriches your view of Christ. As you say, I think if you just view Christ as someone who provides penal substitutionary atonement, you're really just focusing on his office as priest, sacrifice and priest. Yeah. And it's a narrow view of Christ. I call it an anemic view of Christ. And you miss the prophet. He began his ministry. He came preaching, says Mark. And then you miss that he's a king, and on the cross he's wearing a crown, and he's fulfilling those offices. So what do you think? Well, let me actually speak about the structure of your book. You have three main sections. Just going to get to them. The part one, 3 parts of the book: the journey of the Son of God, part 1, where you deal with the whole Christ, the person of Christ, and then part 2, to the far country, Christ's humiliation, and then to the Father's right hand, Christ's exaltation. It's really got a nice sort of story thread to it. Don't know where you got that from, but the journey of the Son of God to the far country and then back to the Father's right hand. Do you want to talk us through that structure and your titles? I see for each chapter are lines from Man of Sorrows. What a name. So yeah, you want to explain the structure of your book in that regard?
Sure. I mean, I'd structured it that way before I came up with the titles. As you may know, I got the titles from the same place you get most of your work from, which is your elder brother. So he came up with those sort of not the chapter titles. I'd already done the Philip Bliss stuff, but the allusions to Bart. So if anyone's worried that it's Bartian, just pin it all on Dr. David Gibson. The content is not Bartian, I can promise. Yeah, I suppose it was really trying to walk people through seeing. So that first section, who is Jesus? The incarnation. How does that work? As best you can explain the mystery or describe the mystery might be a better way of putting it. I think again in that first section that my suspicion is that as evangelicals we're better on defending Jesus as God, the full divinity of Christ, than actually we are on seeing his true humanity, which might seem strange, but I again just observation on the ground rather than from any sort of deep theological reading. But I wonder if we're so sort of G'd up to make sure we defend the divinity of Christ that we end up toning down his humanity in some ways. So that first section is trying to just describe what it means for the Son of God to become incarnate, and also it lays the ground. What are these this threefold office? What are the states of humiliation and exaltation? And then the middle third of the book is tracing Jesus' work as prophet, priest, and king in his humiliation. Again, we want to rush to the cross, don't we? But I hope the book will just help people pause a little bit and track with the journey. Jesus wasn't born and then, taken from the manger and crucified. There's a reason that he was a reason he spent 30 years in anonymity. There's a reason he was circumcised, a reason he was baptized, a reason he taught and healed. And it's not just the trailer to the real, the real action on the cross. And I think you can see his work in all three offices in his time on earth. It's not as if his priestly work is about his death and his kingly work about his resurrection or something. Like he's always working as prophet, priest, and king at every moment of his his ministry. So it's, I suppose, that middle third, the humiliation of Christ takes Christ from the cradle to the grave, to his burial, not just the cross but his burial. And then when you turn to look at the exaltation, the U bends upwards, and we move resurrection, ascension, session. Again, often ignored, his sitting down at the right hand of the Father, and then his return in glory. And again, Christ now is prophet, priest, and king. He's still active in those roles. I suspect that is his ongoing ministry is something that we are perhaps in danger of taking our eye off. As if the resurrection was the end, as it were.
Yeah, and I think I was reminded about that as I read your book, that we tend to think that the offices of prophet, priest, and king come to their fulfillment in Christ, and then when he goes to heaven, it's all over.
Yeah.
You just said that this is what your book so helpfully points out, that the three offices continue to function, but now in an exalted state.
Yeah.
He remains the prophet of his church as the head of the church. Yes. His word by his spirit through his ministers.
Yeah.
Remains the priest interceding for us, ever interceding for us. And then he remains king, the head of the church and the ruler of the world and the universe. And I think that's what's so helpful. And the structures, really lends itself to that, showing that it doesn't all end with his humiliation. It actually continues into his exaltation. I think, the point you made at the beginning that we've got to get his person. We need to understand his person correctly first before we can understand his work. Because if you don't get who he is as the God man, then you won't really appreciate what he's going to do as the God man in his offices. And I think again that's been really helpful in the book, the way you've structured it in that regard. So our Christology is foundational to our soteriology, to put it in theological terms that I would smile at, say that's what I'm referring to. The Americans talk in those terms, the Brits, don't talk in those terms. Tell us this hymn by Philip Bliss, Manus what a names. I really love that in your book, that every chapter is a line from that hymn. You have a lovely part at the very end of your book where you actually talk a little bit about Philip Bliss. I don't mean to spoil it for readers, but do you want to give us a wee insight into what kind of a man he was?
Yeah, sure. I mean, structuring the chapters around the hymn, just sort of came to me at some point. And I realised that the way that hymn worked and the verses were in many ways teasing out the material I've been trying to cover in the book. So I don't know loads about him, but I looked him up because I thought I ought to learn a little bit about him once I'd stolen all his lines. He was a teacher for most of his life, a music teacher, and I think it was Moody that got hold of him in his 30s and convinced him to become an evangelist, and particularly use his music in evangelism, become a hymn writer. And so in his sort of early mid 30s, he turned to that full time. But other than writing Man of Sorrows, I think that the thing that's most striking about him really is sadly is the end. So he was married, and he and his wife were in a crossing the, forgive my pronunciation, but crossing I think it's called the Ashtubula River, somewhere in Ohio anyway. Apologies to Ohioans. And the bridge collapsed, and this train plummeted into the valley below and set on fire. And Bliss himself survived the fall, and was seen alive and well after the fall. But then he realised his wife hadn't escaped the carriage, so he was last seen plunging back into the flames at the bottom of this valley to try and rescue his wife from the burning carriages. That was it. Never seen again, and he was 39. So he sounds like an incredible guy, and one day to meet in glory. But
what a fine character, and I didn't know anything about him, but I love that hymn. We had it at our daughter's funeral, at Layla's funeral. Man of Sorrows, what a name! But always love to hear stories behind the hymn or person who wrote it, and I was very moved when you added that at the very end about Philip. Great. Last few questions. Was there a chapter you enjoyed writing the most? Was there a chapter you found hardest to write?
Yeah, they're probably the same chapter. So I think, or even a section of a chapter, to be honest. Writing on the cry of dereliction. My God, why have you forsaken me? I found that both the hardest and therefore also the most enjoyable, because it took the most work, and I think I need to be the most careful, needed to do the most reading, consult with the wisest minds. And I think in part that's because it takes you to what you were talking about a moment ago, that you've got to keep your Christology central in your soteriology. So so many kind of takes on that cry are, I think, at best careless with how they explain what's going on. You get talk of the Trinity being ripped apart, or even more softly, but I still think unhelpfully, the Father totally ceasing to love his Son. But at the same time, as we said earlier in the conversation, I believe penal substitutionary atonement is right and biblical. That sin is met righteously by God's wrath. So how you hold those things together, doing full justice to the person of Christ, being careful with your doctrine of the Trinity, but also trying to explain how he could be the bearer of our sins. Took a lot of work, really.
What writers helped you in that regard? Like, I noticed that's a chapter where you do reference quite a lot, footnote. So who was it that helped you really articulate that from the past?
Yeah, so any chapter that's full of footnotes is the ones where I was most keen to be backed up by an army of far wiser, greater figures. So if I should just pick one, it'd be Turretin. He deals with it in his Institutes of Elenctic Theology, and like always in Turretin, it's not a particularly easy read, but he's just so careful as he goes through affirming and denying various things. But he's not a poet, is he, Turretin? So you go to other folk I think it's Goodwin who said, it's going to be a slight misquote, so apologies to Thomas Goodwin experts, but Thomas Goodwin said something like, God was never more pleased with his son than when he was most angry with him. And it's those kind of, I think that was from a sermon, so he's trying to be pithy and give these one-liners, but it's teasing out how that works. Pink talks about God's dual attitude towards his son, in his person, but also in his office. I think in there I speak about the difference as Christ considered his person and Christ considered his profession, as the one bearing our sins. But yeah, I think Turretin, if you wanted to go one place for a really careful handling without falling off the horse either side into denying penal substitution or rupturing the Trinity, denying the love of the Father, the Son, Turretin is a masterclass, really.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the richest and sort of deepest and chapter in the book, and the one that will stretch readers most. Also, one of the most profound. I remember Schilder in his 3-volume work on the Passion of Christ. He has a section on the derelict cry, dereliction, and he said, it occurs in the dark, and there's a sense in which we must leave this as a mystery in the dark, that we can never actually fully put all the light on this question. My God, why have you forsaken me? That we'll have to wait until eternity to find out exactly the depth of that, and maybe in eternity we'll never fully know. But I just thought that was an interesting sort of use of the darkness. It's obviously a symbol of the judgment that's falling, but he brings in this element. There's also a sense in which we don't see Christ when he calls that out. He's hidden from us as he calls it out, and there's a sense in which the actual depth of the meaning of it is hidden from us.
If you'd mentioned that a year ago, that would have been really helpful. But
and said, look, at this point, let's just say it was in the dark. So
yeah, exactly. Let's shorten the chapter. The editor would have been over the moon. There is something there, isn't there? And the temptation is to think that there are mysteries in the Christian life: the Trinity, the person of Christ, predestination, sovereignty, and responsibility. But actually, the cross, as evangelicals, we've got that down. Jesus bore the wrath of God for our sins, as if that's somehow an easy thing. But as soon as you start thinking and diving deeper, there's mystery there. And I think, again, my tribe, to use the word that we're all meant to use at the moment, those of us who've really defended penal substitution, we mustn't fall into the trap of thinking that we've comprehended it, or can explain it all, or have got the mechanism down or something. Hugh Martin, in his book on the Atonement, ends one of his chapters saying, that the church grows weak and weary in her spiritual life when she thinks there's no more to what's the quote? No more to delve into in the cross, or something like that. Again, horrible misquote, but it's not an easy doctrine that you can tidy away.
Yeah, I love that quote by Hugh Martin. It's similar to what we're saying, and but I think mystery is the lifeblood of dogmatics, and once we try to remove that element, we really are becoming presumptuous, and B, actually looking at it quite superficially. Then not really depths that's there. Well, Jonty, I think this book will be a real service to the church, as was your other one, Covenants Made Simple. I would encourage all our listeners to get both of those books, but especially look out for Jonty's latest one, Man of Sorrows, King of Glory, coming out by Crossway in June. And I think what's great about it is you've made some of the deep, meaty theological books on the atonement. You've written one that's really accessible for everyday Christians, and anyone can read this book, and they'll be stretched, but they'll also be really encouraged and enriched and fed well. So thank you for serving the church well with that, and we hope at the bookstore we'll give it a good plug.
So does my wife. Thanks very much.
Once you send the promotion check for us, we'll give it a good plug. It's been great to see you again, Jonty. Hope you're down the south coast in some mansion on the south coast of England goes well. Hope it's a restful time, and we wish you
Cheers.
God's blessing on your ministry back up in Leeds as well.
Thanks. Yeah, and you too. Look forward to seeing you soon.